For more than 25 years, a single steel door sat at the back of a small watch repair shop, and no living person knew how to open it. The man who built it told no one his secret, not even his own daughter, the child he had pushed out of his life when she was 9 years old. When she finally pressed the small brass watch he had given her into the lock he had left waiting in the dark, the door that swung open in front of her did not just hide $475 million. It hid the answer to the question that had cut at her for most of her life. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. Nora Vance had learned to measure her life by the things she could not pay for. She was 34 years old, and she could not pay the second notice from the hospital, the one printed in red that sat on the kitchen counter beneath a jar of dried pasta, because she could not bring herself to look at it directly. She could not pay the full mortgage this month, only most of it. And she had spent 20 minutes on the phone with a man named Greg who kept calling her ma'am in a voice that had stopped meaning anything a long time ago. She could not pay for the field trip permission slip in her daughter's backpack, the one for the science center that cost $18. So she had told Sadie they would do something better that weekend, the two of them together, and had watched her 8-year-old nod and pretend that was the same thing. The house she could not pay for was small and tired, 2 bedrooms on the wrong side of a town called Eastfield, with a porch step that had needed fixing for a year and a furnace that made a sound like an old man clearing his throat. She had loved that house once. She and Daniel had stood in the empty living room the day they got the keys, and he had spun her around on the bare floor, and they had eaten cold pizza on a moving blanket and talked about all the things they would do to it. New paint, a garden out back, a swing set when the time came. They had done the swing set. They had not done most of the rest. Daniel had been gone for 14 months now. It had been the kind of thing that started small and turned into the whole world. A cough that would not leave. A doctor who said it was probably nothing, then said the word that ended the version of her life she had been living. Pancreatic. By the time anyone understood what they were dealing with, there was not much left to do except be brave in front of each other and fall apart alone in the car. He had fought for 9 months. He had been 36. At the end, he weighed less than Sadie, and Nora had held his hand in a room that smelled of disinfectant and lilies somebody had sent, and she had told him she would be fine, that they would both be fine, and it was the only lie she had ever told him. The bills did not stop when the funeral ended. That was the thing nobody warned you about. The casserole stopped, and the cards stopped, and the people who had hugged her so hard in the church parking lot went back to their own lives, which was right and fair, but the bills kept coming as if Daniel were still in that hospital bed running up charges. $40,000 and what the insurance had decided was her problem and not theirs. A second mortgage they had taken in the worst of it, betting on a future where he lived. The car payment, the light bill, the $18 for the science center. So Nora worked. She was a home health aide, which meant she spent her days in other people's houses, lifting other people's mothers out of bathtubs, sorting other people's pills into the little plastic boxes with the days of the week on the lids. She was good at it. She had a way of making frightened old people feel less frightened, of talking to them about their grandchildren and their gardens while she changed their dressings, of seeing the person inside the failing body. It paid almost enough. She picked up cleaning jobs on the side, scrubbing the kind of kitchens she would never own, and on the very worst weeks she sold things. Daniel's watch had gone first, a plain steel thing she had given him on their 5th anniversary, and she had cried in the parking lot of the pawn shop and then driven home and made dinner like nothing had happened. She did not cry much anymore. Crying was a thing you did when there was someone to hear you, and she had learned to be careful in front of Sadie, who watched her the way children watch a sky they think might storm. On the Saturday before the letter came, she took Sadie to the library, because the library was free and warm and full of things a child could want without anyone having to say no to her. Sadie was 8 and serious in the way of children who have watched a parent disappear, careful with her mother in the same way her mother was careful with her, the two of them stepping around each other's grief, like people walking around a hole in the floor. She had Daniel's dark eyes and his habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard, and there were mornings when Nora would look at her across the breakfast table and have to get up and find something to do at the sink. They read 3 picture books on the floor of the children's section, and Sadie checked out a stack as tall as her own forearm, and on the drive home she said, without looking away from the window, that a boy named Marcus from her class was going on the science center trip. and that Marcus said there was a room where you could make lightning come out of your hands. We will do something better, Nora said. Just the two of us. A whole day? Okay, Sadie said, in the small flat voice that meant she understood exactly what that meant and had already decided not to make her mother feel any worse about it, which was somehow the part that hurt the most. Okay, Mom. That night, after Sadie was asleep, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the bills fanned out in front of her and moved the same too small number from one column to another, trying to make it stretch across more than it could ever cover. She thought about the $18 and about the room where you could make lightning with your hands, and she put her head down among the red notices and stayed that way for a while. Then she got up, washed the one mug in the sink, and went to bed, because that was what there was to do. She was good at her work, at least, and that was one thing she could still hold on to. There was a sharp, mean old woman on her Tuesday route who had run off 3 aides before Nora and then quietly decided that Nora was the one who was allowed to stay. And on the hard days, that small, stubborn loyalty was the closest thing she had to solid ground. She had a way of finding the person still living inside a failing body. She had found Daniel in there right at the very end, when there was almost nothing left of him to find, and she had held that person's hand and told him she would be fine. There was exactly one thing Nora owned that she would never sell, no matter how red the notices got. It was a pocket watch. It lived in the top drawer of her dresser, wrapped in a square of soft gray cloth, and it had followed her through every move and every hard winter of her life. It was old, the case a warm rose gold gone dull with handling, about the size of a large coin and heavier than it looked. On the front, worked into the metal in lines so fine you almost needed to feel them rather than see them, was a strange pattern. Not flowers, not initials, not any decoration she had ever seen on any other watch. Spirals and small symbols that wound around the edge of the case like a language written by someone who did not want to be read. There was the usual crown at the top for winding, but there was a second smaller crown set into the side at an odd angle, and Nora had never once in 30 years figured out what it was for. Turning it did nothing. It just sat there, a question with no answer. Her father had given it to her the last good day she could remember having with him. She had been 9. Her mother had been dead 2 years by then, taken by the same indifferent kind of illness that would one day take Daniel, and her father had become a man made of silence, bent over his workbench until midnight, answering her questions with a grunt or not at all. That last day, he had been different. He had taken her out behind the shop where the old apple tree grew, and he had sat her down on the grass, and he had put the watch in her 2 small hands and folded her fingers around it. "You keep this," he had said. His accent had been thick then, the hard music of a country she had never seen. "You keep this with you, Nora, always. Do not sell it. Do not let anyone take it from you. Do not let anyone even know you have it. One day it will matter more than you can understand. Promise me." She had promised. She had been 9 and would have promised him the moon. 2 weeks later, he had put her on a bus to her Aunt Margit's house 3 states away, with a suitcase and a paper bag of sandwiches, and that watch zipped into the inside pocket of her coat, and he had not come with her. He had stood on the platform with his hands in his pockets and his collar turned up, and he had not waved, and that was the picture of her father she had carried for the rest of her life. A man getting smaller as the bus pulled away. A man who chose to stay. She had not always understood him as a cold man. That was the part she tried hardest not to remember, because remembering it complicated the anger, and the anger was easier to carry. When she was very small, before her mother got sick, he had been a different person. She could still half remember sitting on his lap at the workbench under the warm circle of the lamp while he worked, and how he would hold a watch movement up to her ear so she could listen to the tiny frantic heartbeat of it, and tell her in his thick accent that every watch was alive. She remembered him singing to her in the other language, low and tuneless, while he cooked eggs on Sunday mornings. And then her mother had died, and that man was simply gone, replaced piece by piece by the stranger on the platform with his collar turned up. For 30 years she had told herself she must have invented him, dreamed him up out of a child's wishful need, because a man who loved you the way she remembered being loved did not put you on a bus and let you go. She had never once seriously considered the third possibility, the one that did not occur to her until she was standing in his shop among his stopped clocks with his secret breathing behind a slab of steel. That both men had been real, that something had come between them, that the coldness had not been the absence of love at all, but the only shape his love had been allowed to take. He never came for her. He called Aunt Margit's house twice a year, on her birthday and at Christmas, brief stiff conversations conducted as if through a wall, asking if she was warm enough, if she was doing well in school, never once asking the only thing a daughter wants to be asked, which is whether she is happy, whether she is loved, whether she misses him too. He sent money. Aunt Margit always said he sent money, more than you would think a man fixing watches in a small town could spare, and Nora had hated that money because it felt like the receipt for being given away. She had grown up with her aunt, a kind and weary woman who did her best, and she had grown up understanding herself as a girl whose own father had not wanted the trouble of her. She had stopped taking his calls when she was 19. She had not gone to find him when she got married. She had not called him when Sadie was born, had not sent a photograph, had told herself she did not care whether the old man ever knew he had a granddaughter. When the grief over Daniel was at its worst, in the long gray nights when she could not sleep, she had thought about her father once or twice, the way you press on a bruise to see if it still hurts, and it always still hurt, and she always stopped. So when the letter came, she almost threw it away. It arrived on a Tuesday, in a heavy cream envelope that did not look like a bill, which in Nora's experience meant it was a bill with ideas above its station. The return address read Pohl and Associates, attorneys at law, with a town name she did not recognize, Hardship. She set it on the counter with the others and let it sit there for 3 days while she worked a double on Thursday and cleaned the Andersons' house on Friday and took Sadie to the free afternoon at the library on Saturday because the Science Center was $18 they did not have. On Sunday night, after Sadie was asleep, she opened it. The paper inside was thick and formal, the kind of paper that came from offices where the chairs matched. She read it once and understood almost none of it, and then she read it again sitting down because her legs had stopped wanting to hold her. "Dear Mrs. Vance," it began, "we are writing to inform you of the death of your father, Mr. Tomas Brandt, of Hardship, on the 11th of March of this year. Please accept our condolences." The 11th of March. He had been dead for nearly 2 months, and she had not known. He had been dead for 2 months while she sorted pills and scrubbed floors and told her daughter no about a school trip, and nothing in the world had felt any different. She sat with that for a long moment, waiting to feel something clean and simple, grief or relief, and what she felt instead was a strange falling sensation, as if a floor she had spent her whole life standing on had quietly been removed. The letter went on. "Mr. Brandt named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate. The estate consists principally of the commercial property located at 14 Larch Street, Hardship, comprising the building known as Brandt Clock and Watch Repair and its contents, together with the residence above it and certain personal effects. The property is owned free and clear. There are no outstanding debts against the estate. We would ask that you contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of the deed and to receive certain items and instructions your father left specifically in our care for you." She read that last line 3 times. Certain items and instructions your father left specifically in our care for you. He had left her something. The man who had given her away, who had spoken to her through a wall for 10 years and then not at all for 15, had sat in a lawyer's office at some point and arranged for there to be something waiting for her when he died. She did not know what to do with that. It did not fit the story she had told herself for 30 years, the simple, clean story of a girl who was not wanted, and she found she resented it for not fitting, the way you resent a stone in your shoe. She did the math the way she did all math now, by what it could buy. A building, owned free and clear. No debts against it. She had spent 14 months learning that nothing in her life was ever free and clear, that everything had a string and a hook and a man named Greg attached to it. And here was a lawyer telling her that her dead father had left her a building with no strings at all. Even a tired, old building in a town she had never heard of was worth something. It might be worth the $40,000 in red. It might be worth keeping the house she and Daniel had spun around in. It might be worth $18 and 100 small mercies after that. She barely slept. She lay in the dark in the bed that was too big now, holding the pocket watch she had taken out of the drawer without quite deciding to, turning it over in her fingers, feeling the fine, strange symbols under the pads of her thumbs. One day it will matter more than you can understand. He had said that. She had been 9. She had assumed, the way children assume, that he meant it the way grown-ups always seem to mean things, which was to say not really at all. In the morning, she called the number on the letter. A secretary with a warm, efficient voice answered, took her name, and said that Mr. Pohl had been hoping to hear from her, which was a strange thing to say about a stranger. They made an appointment for Thursday. Nora arranged for her neighbor Carol to take Sadie after school, traded a Friday cleaning job to a coworker, and on Thursday morning she got in her aging car and drove north. Hartsboro was 3 hours away, tucked into a fold of low hills where the highway gave up and let two-lane roads take over. It was the kind of town that had clearly been something once and was now mostly remembering it. There was a main street with brick buildings and tall windows, half of them dark, a diner, a hardware store, a church with a white steeple and a clock in the steeple that had stopped at 4:10. There were houses with porches and a river running brown and patient under an iron bridge. The whole place smelled of cut grass and river mud and, faintly, of wood smoke, even in May. Nora drove slowly down the main street looking for the lawyer's office and feeling something she could not name, a tug, as if some part of her recognized a place she had never been. Pohl and Associates turned out to be a single lawyer in 2 rooms above the hardware store, reached by a wooden staircase that announced every step she took. Walter Pohl was a thin man somewhere past 70, with a soft fall of white hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and hands that trembled very slightly when he reached across the desk to shake hers. His office was warm and a little cluttered, the walls lined with books and framed certificates gone amber with age, and there was a clock on every flat surface, Nora noticed, all of them ticking, all of them telling slightly different times. "I have been the executor of your father's affairs for a long time," Mr. Pohl said. Once she was seated and had a cup of coffee, she did not want warming her cold hands. 25 years, if you can believe it. He came to me not long after he bought the shop. A careful man. Very careful. He paused, and his eyes moved over her face with an attention that made her want to look away. "You have his eyes," he said quietly. "I should have known you anywhere." "I didn't really know him," Nora said. The words came out flatter than she meant. We weren't in contact. He sent me away when I was a kid. I don't expect you to understand the situation." Mr. Pohl folded his trembling hands on the desk. "I understand more of it than you might think," he said. "But that is not my story to tell, and your father did not tell it to me in full. He told me only what I needed to carry out his wishes. He told me that one day his daughter would come, and that when she did, I was to give her certain things, and that the rest would explain itself." He opened a drawer and took out a thick folder, soft at the corners from age, and from the folder he removed an envelope and a small ring of keys. He set them on the desk between them and slid them across, the way the lawyer in the story slides the truth a little closer to the person who has to receive it. "There are 3 keys," he said. "This larger one opens the front door of the shop. This one opens the door to the residence upstairs, where he lived." He kept his thumb a moment on the 3rd key, the smallest one, an odd shape, dark old brass with a square head and almost no teeth at all, more like a stub than a key. "And this one," he said, "your father told me you would understand." He said, and I am quoting him as near as I can remember, he said, "The key she needs she already carries. This is only to remind her that there is a door." Nora looked at the small dark key and felt the cold falling sensation again. "What door?" she said. Mr. Pohl shook his head slowly. "I have never been inside it," he said. "In 25 years I went to that shop perhaps a dozen times, and always your father met me in the front room, and always there was a door at the back of the workshop that he never opened in front of me. Steel. Heavy. Out of place in an old building like that, I always thought, the way a bank vault would be out of place in a kitchen. I asked him once, early on, what he kept back there. He said he kept the only thing worth keeping. He never said another word about it, and I never asked again. He had a way of ending a conversation just by looking at you." He was quiet for a moment then, and some private memory moved across his face. "He was not an easy man to know, your father," he said. "In 25 years, I am not certain I could honestly call the 2 of us friends. But I will tell you one thing about him, because I believe you should have it. Every December, the week before Christmas, he would close the shop for an afternoon and come up these stairs and buy a money order, a large one, larger than I ever understood how he could afford, and he would ask me to arrange to send it to an address out of state. He never once told me who it was for. He did it for 25 years and never missed a single year. Not the years the shop did badly, not the winter he was ill and could barely walk. The last one he arranged was this past December, sitting in the very chair you are sitting in now, 3 months before he died. I did not understand, until your letter arrived, that the address he had been sending it to all those years was yours. He looked at her over the top of his glasses, and for a moment his trembling hands went perfectly still. I have sent a great many sad things across this desk in my years of work, Mrs. Vance. I am not certain I have ever sent anything sadder than a man's whole heart, folded up small inside a money order, mailed off every Christmas to a daughter who would not pick up his calls. He pushed the keys the last inch into her hand and closed her fingers around them, and the gesture was so exactly the gesture her father had made with the pocket watch on the last good day that Nora's breath caught and held. There is one more thing, Mr. Pohl said. He hesitated, and for the first time the warmth in his face was edged with something more careful. In the last few years, your father had visitors. Not friends. Men in good suits, from out of town, who came asking about the shop, about whether it was for sale, about what he had inside. He turned them away. He told me once that if anything ever happened to him that did not look natural, I was to make sure the police knew about those men. Nothing ever did happen, he said quickly, seeing her face. He died in his bed. The doctor was satisfied. He was 73 and his heart simply stopped. But he was afraid of something. Mrs. Vance, right up to the end. A man like that, careful as he was, does not stay afraid of nothing for 25 years. So I would ask you, when you go to that shop, to be a little careful yourself. He gave her the address again on a slip of paper, though she did not need it, and he told her the property was hers to do with as she liked. The deed would be transferred within the month, and if she wished to sell, he could recommend an honest agent. She thanked him. She did not tell him she had already decided to sell, that she was already spending the money in her head, the 40,000 in red in the house she and Daniel had loved. She put the keys and the envelope in her bag and went back down the loud wooden stairs into the gray afternoon. Larch Street was 3 blocks off the main road, narrow and shaded by trees just coming into leaf. Brandt Clock and Watch Repair sat in the middle of it, a 2-story brick building with tall windows and a faded sign in gold and black letters above the door. The paint cracked and the gold dimmed to a dull bronze. The windows of the shop were dusty, and behind them she could see the dark shapes of clocks, dozens of them, hung and standing and stopped. There was a hand-lettered card taped inside. The glass that said, in handwriting she somehow knew at once was her father's, closed until further notice. He must have written it himself before the end. He had not known how true it would be. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time before she could make her feet move. The big key turned hard in the lock, the mechanism stiff with disuse, and the door opened with the small silver music of a bell hung above it, a sound that must have rung 1,000 times to announce 1,000 customers, and that now announced only her. The smell came out to meet her, oil and old wood and brass polish and dust, and something underneath it all that she would not let herself name, because it smelled like a man, like the inside of a coat she had buried her face in when she was small. Inside, the shop was a single long room, and it was full of time. Clocks covered the walls, floor to ceiling, every kind she had ever seen and many she had not. Tall case clocks stood like silent guests along one wall. Small carriage clocks and mantel clocks crowded the shelves. There were cuckoo clocks and ship's clocks and a great brass clock with the works exposed under a glass dome, and they were all stopped, every one of them, their pendulums still, their hands frozen at different hours, a whole room of time that had quit at the moment its keeper put down his tools. The quiet was enormous. Nora had never stood in a room with so many clocks and heard no ticking at all. It felt like standing in a choir that had all stopped breathing at once. A long workbench ran down the center of the room under a row of hanging lamps. On it, laid out with a neatness that broke her heart a little, were the tools of his trade. Tiny screwdrivers in a graduated row from largest to smallest, none of them bigger than a matchstick. Loops and eyepieces, brass tweezers worn smooth where his fingers had held them. A movement half disassembled on a square of green felt. The work simply stopped, a watch that would never now be finished, its owner perhaps still waiting somewhere for a call that would not come. There was a stool pushed back from the bench at an angle, as if he had only just stood up from it, and Nora had to grip the edge of the counter, because for one cracked second she could see him there, bent over the work, the lamp light on his white hair, and she had to remind herself that he was gone, that she had not seen him in 15 years, that she had not even known he was dead. She made herself look at the walls instead, and that was when she began to understand that her father had not been only what she had thought he was. Because a man who fixed watches in a small town did not own the things that were in this room. She did not know the names of them yet, but she could feel the weight of them. On the bench, under a clean cloth she lifted with 2 fingers, sat instruments she had no words for, machines of brass and steel, a lathe so fine and so old it looked like a museum piece, gauges and jigs of a kind she could not imagine a town like Hardship ever needing. On a shelf behind the counter, in a locked glass case she could not open with any of her keys, sat a row of watches that were not waiting to be repaired. They were too beautiful for that. Even through the dusty glass, she could see gold and deep blue enamel and the glint of something that might have been diamonds, faces with too many dials, hands too fine to be real, and she pressed her own face close to the glass and looked at them and felt her heart begin to do something strange and quick in her chest. She did not know what she was looking at. She only knew that watches like these did not belong in a town like Hardship, behind a dusty register, above a stool with a pair of worn brass tweezers. One of them had a face like a small window cut into a living machine, wheels turning behind clear sapphire, a tiny golden weight swinging back and forth inside a cage no larger than a fingernail. Another was the deep blue of the sky an hour after sunset, with small points of white light set into it that might have been enamel and might have been diamonds, and a single slender hand that did not seem to tell the hour at all, but to follow the moon across that little painted night. They were stopped, like everything else in the room, and somehow the stillness made them more beautiful and more sorrowful at once. A row of small frozen wonders waiting for a hand that was never going to wind them again. There were photographs on the wall by the register, in plain black frames, and she went to them slowly. Her father, young. She had almost no pictures of him young, and here he was, perhaps 30, in a white coat in a vast bright workshop full of men in white coats, all of them bent over benches, and her father standing in the center with his arms crossed, and the ghost of a proud smile she had never once seen on his face in life. Behind him on the wall of that other workshop was a name, painted large, Reinhardt and Sohn, and beneath it a date she did not yet know to be afraid of. Her father, a little older, shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit, both of them smiling for the camera, and someone had drawn a small, careful line through the suited man's face in black ink, just one line, like a man crossing a name out of his life. And then, at the end of the row, in a frame that had been dusted more recently than the others, so that the glass was clean while the rest were gray, a photograph of a baby. Nora stopped breathing. It was her. She knew it the way you know your own hand. A baby in a yellow blanket, fat-cheeked and furious. And it was her. She had seen this exact photograph once before in Aunt Margit's album, taken in the hospital the day she was born. Her father had a copy. He had kept it on the wall of his shop, dusted, in a clean frame, in the place by the register where he would have seen it 10,000 times a day for 34 years. She reached out and touched the glass over the small, angry face, and her vision blurred, and the careful story she had carried her whole life. The simple story of the girl who was not wanted, cracked straight down the middle, and would not hold. She did not know how long she stood there. When she could move again, she wiped her face with the heel of her hand, and that was when she noticed the notebooks. There were perhaps a dozen of them stacked on the workbench, half hidden behind a tray of parts, cloth-bound, their covers soft and dark with years of oil. She would have taken them for the dull ledgers of a repair business and left them where they sat, except that the one on top had fallen open, and what filled the pages was not columns of numbers. It was her father's hand, the same fine cramped letters as the card in the window, page after page after page of it. She lifted the notebook the way you would lift something that might come apart in your hands, and she sat down on his stool under the lamp, and she began to read. Most of it she could not follow. Long stretches were technical, diagrams of movements crowded with arrows and measurements, notes to himself about springs and wheels in a shorthand only another watchmaker could have read, and some of it was written in the other language entirely, the hard music of the platform, which she had never been taught. But scattered all through the technical pages, in plain English, as though he had set them down for someone other than himself, were entries that had nothing to do with watches at all. She read one dated the autumn of the year she had turned 6. They have offered me the money again today, it said. A very great deal of it. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. They want the new calendar movement, and they want my silence about where the finished pieces are sent and what is carried inside them. And they have made it very plain that these two things are the same thing. R smiled the entire time he was saying it, which is how I know that he means every word. I built the finest work of my life for that house, and they have engraved another man's name on it and sold it as their own. And that, perhaps, I could have learned to forgive. A man can swallow a great deal of pride for a steady wage and a roof over his child. But I have seen the books now. I have seen where the watches travel, and into whose hands, and what rides hidden inside the cases. And there are things a man cannot swallow. I do not yet know what I am going to do. I know only that I am afraid in a way I have not been since I was a boy. The next English entry came almost a year later, the writing harder, pressed deeper into the paper. My wife is gone, it read. The doctors could do nothing, and I could do nothing. And the house I gave my best years to send a wreath and a card, and not one of them came, except R, who stood at the back of the church and watched me the entire time instead of the coffin. He came to remind me that he knows the road to my door. He came to remind me that I still have a daughter. He never said the words. He did not need to say the words. I held Nora's small hand at the graveside, and I understood, fully and for the first time, exactly what these men would use to keep me quiet. Nora's hands had started to shake. She read the date again. She had been 7. Her mother a year in the ground. She turned the page. I have made my decision, the next entry said, and it is the worst thing I have ever done and the only thing left that I can do. I cannot protect her and fight them at the same time. That much is plain. As long as she is here, in this house, where they can see her face, she is the thing they will reach for, and they will reach for her. I have no illusions remaining about these men, so I will send her away. I will send her where they have no reason to look, to my sister, under a name that touches none of this in any paper they can buy, and I will make myself into precisely the thing they want me to be. A finished old man who has given up. A man who fixes clocks in a town no one has heard of and is no longer worth the trouble of burying. I will let them believe they have won. I will let her believe I do not want her. God forgive me for that last part, because it is the one I cannot bear to write, what she is going to believe about me. She is 9 years old, and I am going to let her grow into a woman who thinks her own father did not want her, because if she knew the truth she would carry it with her wherever she went, and it would not be safe, and she might come back to me, and I would rather she hate me alive in some far-off city than weep over me dead in this one. Nora could no longer see the page. She pressed the back of her wrist hard against her eyes and made them clear, because she had to know the rest of it, all of it. The entries that came after were spaced further and further apart, whole years falling between them, and the change in them frightened her more than the fear had. They grew calm. They grew patient. They became, very slowly, a plan. I am building it for her, said one, dated the year she would have turned 15, the year she had sat in Aunt Margit's kitchen hating the very thought of him. Everything I know, everything that house took the credit for, everything I have left in these two hands, I am putting it into the work behind the door, where it is safe, where they can neither find it nor take it. It will be worth more than those men could ever guess, more than enough to give her back the life I took from her with my own hands. And one day, when it is finally safe, when I am gone and they have grown tired of watching an empty old shop, she will come, and she will open it, and she will understand at last. I have already made certain that she carries the key. I put it into her hands myself and let her believe it was only a watch. She does not know that she has been carrying the door to her own freedom in her coat pocket all these years. It is the only joke the good Lord has left me, and on some nights it is the single thing that can still make me laugh out loud in this empty room. The last entry in the notebook was only a few lines long. If she is reading these words, then I am dead, and she has come, and the worst of it is over, and the best of it is only beginning. Nora, there are things in this room worth a fortune, and every single one of them belongs to you. But they were never the reason I built it. I built it so that one day you would stand exactly where you are standing now and read exactly these words and finally know the one thing I ever truly needed you to know. I am sorry. I never stopped. Not for one single day of your life. Nora sat on her father's stool in the cold lamplight with the open notebook across her knees and wept in a way she had not allowed herself to weep in 14 months. Not at the funeral. Not in the pawnshop parking lot. Not in the long gray nights in the bed that was too big. She wept for the man on the platform with his collar turned up, who had stood there and let his small daughter believe a cruelty for 30 years so that she would be allowed to live, and who had spent every one of those 30 years bent over this bench in the dark, building her a road back home. It was a long time before she could stand. When she finally did, she closed the notebook with great care and set it down gently on the bench, and she dried her face with both hands, and she understood that there was no question now of leaving, no question of selling, no question of coming back some other day better prepared. She had to see what was behind the door. A curtain of heavy canvas separated the front of the shop from a back room, and she pushed through it. The back room was smaller and colder and even more crowded with the leavings of his work. More benches, shelves of small drawers, hundreds of them, each labeled in his fine, cramped hand with words she did not understand. Boxes of parts. A narrow iron staircase in the corner that must lead up to the apartment where he had lived and died. And on the far wall, exactly as Mr. Pohl had said, set into the old brick where no door had any business being, stood a slab of steel. It was seamless and gray and modern, utterly wrong in that room of old wood and older brass, for inches thick at least by the look of the frame, the kind of door you saw on a bank vault in a film. There was no handle. There was no keyhole that any ordinary key would fit. There was only, set into the center of it at the height of her heart, a round recess about the size of a large coin, and around that recess, etched fine into the steel, were spirals and small strange symbols winding in a ring. She knew that pattern. She had carried it in her dresser drawer for 30 years. Nora's hand went to her bag without her telling it to, and her fingers found the soft gray cloth, and she unwrapped the pocket watch and held it up in the dim back room. And she looked from the watch to the door, and from the door to the watch, and the breath went out of her in a sound that was half a laugh and half something with no name. The symbols matched. Not similar. The same. Every spiral, every mark, the pattern on the watch case and the pattern around the recess in the steel were the same hand, the same language, made to be read against each other. The key she needs she already carries. She stepped close to the door, her heart slamming now, and she fit the watch into the round recess, and it settled into the steel as if the space had been cut from a mold of it, which she understood with a cold rush it almost certainly had. For a moment nothing happened. She pressed it gently. Nothing. She turned the whole watch clockwise in its seat, the way you would turn a key, and felt resistance. Then a soft click, then nothing more. She turned it back. Nothing. She stood there with her father's gift pressed into her father's door, 25 years of silence on one side, and the only thing worth keeping on the other, and she did not know what she was missing. She closed her eyes. She thought about the second crown, the small one set into the side of the watch at its odd angle, the one she had turned 1,000 times in 30 years, and that had never once done anything at all. She had always thought it was broken, or decorative, or some mistake of manufacture. She kept the watch pressed into the recess with her left hand, and with her right thumb and finger she found that second little crown, and she turned it. This time it moved. It moved because the watch was seated in the door, because the door and the watch were halves of one machine that had been waiting 25 years to be made whole. and as she turned that second crown, she felt something deep inside the steel begin to respond. A series of soft mechanical falls, tumblers dropping in sequence, the most beautiful and terrible sound she had ever heard. A lock that her father had built with his own hands coming awake at the touch of his own daughter for the first time since the day he sealed it. And then, faint but unmistakable, the symbols around the recess began to glow. Not bright. A thin cold blue, like the last light at the bottom of the sky after the sun is gone, racing around the ring of the lock one mark at a time as the second crown turned. And when the final symbol lit, something inside the door let go with a heavy sigh of trapped air, and the steel shuddered and began to move, sliding inward into the dark. Nora pulled the watch free with shaking hands and stepped back. The door opened perhaps a hand's width and stopped. Cold air breathed out of the gap, clean and dry and strange, and beyond it was darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. She could see nothing. She had no flashlight, no plan, no idea what waited on the other side except that her father had given up everything she had ever wanted from him in order to seal it away, and that men in good suits had come to a small town for 25 years to ask about it, and that it was worth being afraid of. She should come back, she thought, in daylight, prepared, with someone who knew what they were doing. And it was in that exact moment, standing in the cold back room with the vault breathing open in front of her, that she heard the bell. The little silver bell above the front door of the shop, the one that had rung to announce her arrival, the one that rang only when the door was opened. It rang now. Nora went very still. The vault breathed at her back. The clocks in the front room stood stopped and silent, 100 frozen faces, and through the heavy canvas curtain, she heard the careful sound of a man's footsteps crossing the wooden floor of the shop she had locked behind her, a man who had a key, or had not needed one, moving slowly through the room full of her father's stopped clocks toward the curtain at the back, and she understood, with a certainty that turned her cold from her scalp to her heels, that she was not the only one who had been waiting for that door to open. For the length of one breath, and then another, Nora did not move at all. The footsteps came on across the front room, slow and even, the steps of a man who believed he had all the time in the world, and that evenness frightened her more than running ever could have. She knew the shape of her own trap without having to think about it. Behind her, the open vault and its weight of darkness. To her left, the narrow iron staircase winding up to the apartment where her father had lived and died, a way up, but not a way out. Around her, the cold back room with its hundreds of small labeled drawers and its smell of oil and brick. There was the front door, and between her and the front door there was the man, and there was nowhere in the world for her to go. Her hand found the pocket watch on the bench and closed around it and slid it into her coat without any decision on her part, the way you pull a child back from a curb before your mind has caught up to the car. The canvas curtain moved aside. The man who stepped through it was tall and unhurried and entirely wrong for the room. The way the steel door was wrong. The way a surgeon would be wrong at a country fair. He wore a charcoal overcoat that had cost more than Nora made in a season, and soft leather gloves. And his hair was iron gray at the temples over a face that had been practicing pleasantness for so many years that the pleasantness had worn thin, like the gold on the sign outside, so that something flat and patient showed through underneath. He was perhaps 55. He carried nothing in his hands, and somehow that was the most frightening thing about him, because a man who lets himself into a dead man's shop after dark and carries nothing in his hands he means to keep free. He stopped just inside the curtain and let his eyes move over the room, over the open door, over her, and he was not surprised by any of it. He gave a small nod, almost like approval, the way a man nods at a job another man has done well. "Mrs. Vance," he said. It was not a question. The sound of her married name in his mouth, the name Daniel had given her in a courthouse on a bright cold day, spoken in this room by this stranger, made something crawl across her skin. "Who are you?" she said. "How do you know my name?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, and she was grateful for that small mercy. "My name is Keen," he said, as if that explained anything. "I had hoped to reach you before you drove all this way. This is a conversation far better had in daylight, over coffee, between reasonable people." He glanced at the open vault, and for just a moment the practiced pleasantness fell away, and she saw the thing underneath it. Look at that dark gap in the wall, with a want so naked it was almost hunger. "But your father always did have a gift," he said. For opening things at the wrong hour. Without quite deciding to, Nora moved one step so that she stood between him and the open door. It was an absurd thing to do. A small woman in a travel-creased coat putting herself between a vault and a man like that, and she saw him register it and find it faintly amusing. You misunderstand your situation, he said, not unkindly. I represent a firm. An old firm, a respected one, with a long and once very productive association with your father. There are matters between us that were never finished. I have come to finish them, and I promise you it can be done in a way that is very much to your advantage. Reinhardt and Sohn, Nora said. The name was out of her before she could stop it, dredged up from the wall by the register and the cramped pages of the notebooks, and she watched it land. Keen's pleasant face went still, just slightly, just for an instant, and it was the first true thing she had seen in it. Ah, he said softly. You have read his little books. Good. Then we can skip the part where I pretend, and you pretend, and we waste an evening neither of us has. He took a slow step into the room. Let me be very plain, because I think you are a practical woman, and the last year has taught you the value of being plain. You are a widow. You have a daughter. You have, if my information is current, somewhere near $40,000 in medical debt and a second mortgage on a house you cannot keep. He said it the way another man might read a weather report, and the chill of being known, of having the worst facts of her life recited back to her by a stranger in her father's shop, went through her like cold water. Whatever is behind that door, Mrs. Vance, you cannot keep it. You cannot sell it. You do not even know what it is. The moment you try to do anything at all with it, there will be questions you cannot answer and lawyers you cannot afford, and a kind of attention no one in your position survives. Or, he let the word sit there, or you walk out of this shop tonight, and you go home to your little girl, and by the time she wakes up there is a number in your account that makes every problem you have ever had simply stop. And you never think about the town of Hartsboro again as long as you live. And if I say no, Nora said. Keen did not threaten her. That was the worst of it. He looked at her almost gently, the way you look at someone about to make a mistake you have watched other people make. Your father said no, he said. For 25 years he said no. And look where it left him. An old man, alone, in a town no one has heard of, dead in a narrow bed, with a daughter who would not pick up the telephone when he called. He tilted his head. I am offering you the chance not to be him. It landed exactly where he meant it to land, square in the softest part of her, in the 14 months of guilt she carried like a stone, and for 1/6 second she could not breathe around it. And then something else rose up under the grief, something hot, and it had the shape of a money order mailed every Christmas for 25 years, and a baby photograph dusted clean and kept by a register for 34, and a tiny watch she had not yet seen, wound faithfully every week of her life by a man she had been taught to believe did not want her. You stood in that church, she said. The words came from somewhere she did not know she had. Not you. Your people. You stood at the back of my mother's funeral so my father would understand what you would do to me. I read it tonight. In his hand. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. So do not stand in his shop and tell me you are saving me from being him. He is the only one in this whole story who was ever trying to save anybody. For a moment Keen simply looked at her, and the flat thing behind his eyes considered her with a new and colder attention. The way you reconsider a lock you had assumed was simple. Then he took another step toward her, and the room was very small, and her back was close to the cold breath of the open door, and his gloved hand began to rise. A sharp rapping struck the front glass. 3 hard knocks, and then a woman's voice, carrying right through the shop, loud and unbothered and unafraid. Tom? Tom, that you in there? Your lights are on. Keen went still. For a long moment nobody in the shop moved. The knocking did not come again, but the voice did, a little louder, with the particular flat patience of someone who intends to stand on a sidewalk all night if she has to. Tom Brandt, I can see the lights. Keen's eyes flicked toward the front of the shop and back, and Nora watched the arithmetic run behind them, fast and cold. Whatever he had been a breath ago, he was a careful man first, and a careful man does not do the kind of thing his rising hand had promised with a witness standing in the light across the street, a witness who knew the dead owner well enough to call him Tom. The pleasant mask slid back over his face as smoothly as a drawer closing. Think carefully, Mrs. Vance, he said, stepping back, his voice once more the voice of a reasonable man at a reasonable hour. What I am offering you is the easy road, and the easy road does not stay open forever. Someone will be in touch very soon. I would take the call. He let his gaze travel once more, slow and proprietary, around the room, over the bench and the drawers and the dark mouth of the vault, the way a man looks at a house he has already decided to buy. You really did open it, he said, almost to himself, almost with wonder. 25 years. And it was a watch repairman's girl with a key in her pocket. Then he parted the curtain and walked out through the long front room full of stopped clocks, his shoes quiet on the old floor, and the little silver bell rang once as the door let him out into the dark, and through the dusty glass Nora saw him cross the street unhurried and fold himself into a long pale car that pulled away without ever turning on its lights until it was halfway down the block. She realized she had not been breathing. She let it out. A face appeared at the gap in the curtain, and Nora's heart leapt before she understood what she was seeing. An old woman, perhaps 70, in a quilted coat thrown on over a diner apron, gray hair escaping a loose knot, and in one hand a long steel flashlight that she was holding much more like a club than like a light. He is gone, the woman said. Watched him pull off. She looked Nora up and down, taking in the travel-creased coat, the wet eyes, the way she stood guarding a hole in the wall, and then her gaze went past Nora to the front room, to the wall by the register, and came back, and something in her face changed and softened and cracked all at once. Lord have mercy, she said quietly. You are his girl. I am sorry, Nora said. Who you have his eyes. The woman stepped fully through the curtain, lowering the flashlight. I would know them anywhere. He kept your picture up by the register the whole time I knew him. A baby in a yellow blanket, mad as anything. He dusted it. Never dusted one other thing in that whole shop, but he dusted that. Her voice thickened. You are Nora. Nora's name in the mouth of a stranger, again, in the same room. But this time it did not crawl across her skin. This time it went straight to her chest, and sat there, warm and unbearable. I am, she said. Edith, the woman said. I run the diner across the street. Have for 30-some years. She glanced back toward the front windows, toward the dark where the pale car had gone. Saw your lights on tonight. First time that shop has been lit since March. And I saw that fellow's car parked all wrong out front, and I did not like the cut of him going in, so I came over with the only thing I had handy. She lifted the flashlight a few inches and set it down on the bench. Was not sure what I was going to do with it. Hit him, I expect, if it came to that. Despite everything, Nora made a sound that was almost a laugh. You knew my father, she said. Far as anybody did, which was not far. Edith pulled the apron straight, an old habit, something to do with her hands. He ate at my counter most days. Same stool, end of the row, back to the wall so he could see the door. Coffee, eggs, dry toast, and not 3 words some mornings. But he came every day for years, and a person tells you things over enough years of eggs whether they mean to or not. She looked at Nora carefully. He was a kind man, your father, under all that flint. Lonely as a lighthouse. And these last years he was scared. Scared of what? Of men like the one that just walked out of here. Edith's mouth went hard. They would come every so often. Always out-of-town plates. Always a rental, always a good suit. They would go in, they would come out, and Tom would come across to the diner after, gray as a dish rag, and not eat a thing. I asked him once, straight out, what those men wanted from a little watch shop. And he looked at me, and he said, nothing I will ever give them. And he changed the subject, and I never got another word out of him about it. She paused. My Hal would have known what to make of them. Hal was the county sheriff, 31 years, until his heart gave out. I was a lawman's wife a long time, honey. I know a dangerous man when one walks past my window. That one tonight was the most dangerous thing I have seen come down this street in years, and he came out of that car like he owned the deed to the whole town. Something in Nora went cold at that, a different cold than the vault. She thought of Eastfield, 3 hours south, and a small dark-eyed girl asleep in a borrowed bed at Carol's, and she did not yet understand the full shape of her fear, but she felt it move. Excuse me, she said. I need to make a call. She stepped into the front room, among the silent clocks, and called Carol, and it rang 4 times before a sleep-fogged voice answered, and Nora made herself sound ordinary. Everything fine. Just checking in. Sadie down. Good. Good. Hey, Carol, Do me a favor and throw the deadbolt tonight. Would you, front and back? No reason. I just worry. Carol, half asleep, said of course, honey, and call when you are heading home. And Nora said she would, and hung up, and stood for a moment with the phone against her chest in the dark among her father's stopped clocks until her heart slowed. When she came back, Edith was standing at the curtain, looking through it at the open steel door, the flashlight already in her hand. All right, Edith said. You going to tell me what your father had behind a bank door in the back of a watch shop? Or are we going to go look? Nora told her, as plainly as she could, standing there in the cold. The watch he had given her at 9 and told her never to sell. The symbols that matched the door. The notebooks and what was in them. The house that had stolen his finest work and put another man's name on it. And the worst thing, the notebooks only circled. The thing that had kept an old man afraid for 25 years. Edith listened without interrupting, her lawman's wife face giving nothing away, and when Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then let us see what he died holding on to, Edith said softly. She thumbed the flashlight on. Stay behind me. What waited on the other side of that door would explain every cruel and lonely choice Tomas Brandt had ever made, and it would put both women in more danger than either of them yet understood, because the men who had hunted that shop for a quarter of a century were not finished, and the oldest and most patient of them was already on the road. They went through the door together, the old woman first with her light, and the dead man's daughter close behind, and the dark gave way in front of the beam. It was not a closet, and it was not a room. It was a stair, for shallow brick steps going down, and then a low vaulted passage that ran back beneath the shop, dry and cold and clean, and as Edith's light swept along it, Nora heard a soft, steady hum she could not place until she understood it. A machine. Somewhere in the walls a small machine was breathing, holding the air at a temperature and a dryness it had held for years, because the things down here had been built to outlast the man who made them, and he had meant them to be perfect when she came. He put climate control on a hole in the ground, Edith murmured. Lord Tom. The passage walls were brick, old and carefully laid, and set into them at the height of Nora's eyes was a row of small niches, each one no bigger than a hand, each with its own little light, and as the two women came level with the first niche, the light inside it woke on its own, a soft warm glow, and then the next, and the next, waking one at a time as they passed, so that they walked down that buried corridor inside a slowly opening chain of small lights. And Nora understood that her father had built this too, that he had wanted whoever came to walk this exact path in this exact order, and that the path was not made of stone but of memory. The first niche held a photograph in a simple frame. A young woman in a summer garden, laughing, her head thrown back, her hand raised against the sun, in a dress the color of butter. Nora had never seen the picture before, but she knew the face, because she carried a handful of its features in her own and had spent her whole life looking for the rest of them. Her mother, on the small card beneath, in her father's fine cramped hand, 3 words. Lena, the summer before Nora. That your mama? Edith said quietly. I do not have many pictures of her, Nora said. Her voice did not work right. She died when I was 7. I barely remember the garden. And yet, looking at the butter-colored dress and the thrown-back head, a fragment came to her that she had not touched in years, so small she had never been sure she had not invented it. A garden in late light. Her mother kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves pushed up, humming something with no tune, snapping the dead heads off the flowers and dropping them into the pocket of her apron, and the green smell of cut stems, and a hand coming up to tuck a loose strand of Nora's hair behind her ear, without the humming ever stopping. That was the whole of it. 4 or 5 seconds of a woman who had been gone for 27 years. Nora had spent her life believing she had nothing of her mother, and here in a cold passage under her father's shop she understood that she had been carrying that garden the entire time, folded up small the way her father folded everything, and that he had known it, and that this was why he had put the picture first. The second niche held a child's drawing, flattened under glass and gone soft yellow with age. 3 stick figures stood in a wobbly row under an enormous spiked yellow sun, a tall one, a middle one in a triangle dress, a small one with a scribble of dark hair, and underneath, in the proud uneven capitals of a very young hand, 3 words again. Mama Papa Me. And in the corner, in the same child's letters, a name. Nora. And under that, very small, in her father's writing, the only label he had added. She was 5. She gave it to me the week before her mother got sick, and I have looked at it every day since. Nora put her hand over her mouth. The third niche held her parents' wedding photograph, the two of them young and stiff and shining outside a church she did not recognize. Her father in a borrowed-looking suit with a look on his face she had truly never seen there. Open, undefended, happy. The card read, "We had nothing. It was the best day of my life until the day you were born." She had seen that face once. Not in any photograph. On the last good day, the day he gave her the watch, before the world tilted and he became a stranger, he had looked at her across the kitchen table with exactly that open and undefended look, and she had been far too young to know it was a face a person wears only for someone they love more than their own safety. She had spent 30 years rewriting him in her memory as a cold man, a hard man, a man with a turned-up collar walking away from her on a railway platform, because the cold version was the only one that made the leaving bear any sense at all. The man in the wedding photograph and the man on the platform were the same man. She was only now, standing here, being made to hold both of them at once, and it was almost more than her 2 hands could carry. The fourth niche held a small velvet box, open, and inside it on a bed of faded satin lay a thin gold wedding ring. "Your mother's," the card said. "She asked me to keep it for you. I have kept it for you. It was always going to be yours." By the fifth niche Nora could barely see, and she had to stop and press the back of her wrist to her eyes the way she had on his stool upstairs, and when she could look again the small light showed her a watch. Not the pocket watch. A tiny thing, a wristwatch, size for the wrist of a girl of 9 or 10, in the same warm rose gold as the watch in her pocket, with a fine pale face and slender hands, and when she leaned close she could see, engraved minutely on the back, the same spirals and small strange symbols that wound around the pocket watch and around the door. The card beneath it was longer than the others. "I made this for your 10th birthday," it read. "I never got to give it to you. I have wound it by hand every week for 24 years, so that on the day you finally came it would be running to meet you. If it has stopped, then I have stopped too, and not long before. Forgive an old man his one foolishness. I could not give you a childhood. I could give you the time." Nora looked at the little watch's face. The hands stood still. They had stopped at some hour in the second week of March, a few days, she would later count, before an old man lay down in a narrow bed upstairs and did not get up, the last winding of his life run quietly down while no one was there to turn the crown. She did not try to stop the tears this time. There seemed no point. The sixth and last niche held a single folded sheet of paper, soft with handling, and the card beside it said, "Your mother wrote this for you when you were small, before she knew how little time she had. I could not give it to you then. Read it when you are ready. It is the last of her you do not already carry." Nora did not open it there. She could not yet, not standing up in a cold passage with the night and the men still waiting above. She took it with a hand that shook and held it against the letter she had not yet read, and she promised her mother silently that she would come back to her words when she could survive them. And she went on, because at the end of the passage the light had grown, and the vault had opened into a room. Edith's flashlight was hardly needed now. As they stepped down into the chamber, lamps came up of their own accord, soft and even, the kind of clean, steady light a jeweler works under, and the room they lit was not large, but Nora forgot the cold and the fear and even, for a moment, her grief, because she had never in her life seen anything like it. The walls were lined with cases, glass-fronted cabinets and rows of shallow drawers, the orderly archive of a man who had spent every spare hour of 25 years filling it, and behind the glass and within the half-open drawers lay watches. Not 3 or 4, dozens, scores, rank upon rank of them on small stands and cushions, each one finished, each one whole, none of them the broken patience of the front room, but completed things, perfect things, and even stopped, even silent. They caught the light and threw it back in gold and steel and deep enamel blue. She moved along the cases without breathing. One watch showed the moon in a little window, riding across a sky of real dark blue stone scattered with points of white, fuller on one edge than the other, a sliver of true night caught and kept. Another stood open at the back so that its movement showed, a city of tiny wheels and bridges, and within it, no bigger than a grain of rice, a small cage that she somehow knew was meant to turn and turn forever to cheat the pull of the earth, stilled now, waiting. Another was no thicker than 2 coins laid together, a flat disk of gold you might have taken for a button until you saw the impossible fineness of its face. Another had small hammers and coiled wires inside it that she understood, without knowing how she understood, were made to chime the hours aloud on command, a whole silent orchestra folded into a thing smaller than a plum. She did not know what any one of them was worth. She did not have the words or the numbers for it. She only felt the weight of the room settle over her, the sheer impossible labor of it. 10,000 nights bent over a bench under a lamp by a man the world believed had given up, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of one of the cases and let it hold her up. She thought of the front room overhead. Every clock in it stopped at a different hour, a whole shop of time that had quit when its keeper put down his tools, and she understood now that the stillness up there had been the lie and this room was the truth. While the town watched a beaten old man fix carriage clocks for pocket change and pitied him a little and forgot him, he had come down these 4 steps night after night for 25 years and built this. She thought of the money order mailed every Christmas, larger than Walter Pohl could understand how he afforded, and she thought of the dry toast and the eggs at Edith's counter, and she did the arithmetic of it. A man choosing this cold-buried room over every comfort a fortune could have bought him, choosing it over warmth and company and an easier old age, and she could not finish the sum, because the answer to it was simply her own name. Nora, Edith said, very low. She was standing in the center of the room, and her light, forgotten in her hand, was pointed down at the floor. Honey, I have sold pie to half the rich men in this county at one time or another, and I have never in my life stood in a room that felt like this one. In the center of the room, alone on its own stand under its own small light, sat one watch set apart from all the rest. It was larger than the others, and plainer at first glance, and Nora understood the moment she looked at it that it was the reason for the room. It had a face within a face within a face, small dials for the day and the date and the month, and something she would later learn counted the leap years 4 at a time, and a moon, and it was set, the card before it said, to run true for 100 years without correction, every short month and long month and stolen February counted, and kept by the machine alone. It was the most beautiful object Nora had ever seen, and it was beautiful the way a cathedral is beautiful, because of everything it had cost. On the back, engraved deep and clear where no one could ever again pretend otherwise, were 2 things. A date from the year before she was born, and a name, T. Brandt. This is mine, the card said simply. They put another man's name on the copy and sold it to the world and called it the finest watch of the age. This is the first one, and the true one, and the best one, and it is the only thing I ever made that I refused, in the end, to let them take. When you show this to the right people, they will know everything. The watch cannot lie. I built it that way on purpose. Nora stood before it a long moment. 100 years, the card had said, set to keep itself true for 100 years with no hand to correct it. She thought about that. He had built a machine in the year before she was born that would go on counting the days long after he was gone, through every February too short and every leap year that came to mend it, faithful and alone in the dark, and he had built it so well that it would still be right whenever she came, even if she had not come until she was an old woman herself. It was a watch, and it was also a letter, and it was also a kind of promise made in metal by a man who could not be certain he would live to keep it any other way. She did not touch it. She was not ready to touch it. Against the far wall stood a plain steel cabinet, and Nora opened it because the card on the masterwork had told her to, and inside were not watches but books, ledgers, a dozen of them and more, and folders of papers and photographs, and at the front of it all, set apart, a single ordinary-looking gentleman's watch lying open with its case back off, and beside it a small magnifier and a card. This is how they did it, the card said. Look. And Nora looked through the glass and saw, beneath where the movement should have sat, a second hidden floor in the case, a shallow sealed compartment no thicker than a coin, empty now, waiting, and she understood in a slow sick rush what her father's notebooks had only circled at, what had written inside the beautiful watches of Reinhardt, and sewn across how many borders for how many years, carried on the wrists of admired men, and waved through every gate in the world, because who searches a masterpiece, who breaks open a thing of beauty, who would ever dream? On a small desk beneath the steel cabinet sat a lamp, and under the lamp, square in the center of the green blotter, an envelope, and on the envelope, in the hand she now knew better than her own, a single word. Nora. She sat down in his chair. She turned on his lamp, though there was light enough. She opened the envelope with her thumb, carefully, the way she had opened everything of his that night, and she unfolded the pages, and she read. My Nora, it began. I will write this as if you were standing where I hope you will one day stand. Because if you are reading it, then you are, and the thought of it is the only thing that has kept me at this bench on the nights when the work would not come and the silence in this room was very loud. You know the name on the wall by now. Reinhardt and Sohn. When I was a young man, it was the finest name in the whole world for the thing I could do, the oldest house, the most respected, and when they took me in I thought I had been handed my whole life. I gave them the best of myself for years. I gave them the calendar you saw on its stand in this room, the work I will be proud of on the day I die, and they engraved another man's name across the back of it, and sold it as their own and shook my hand while they did it. That, my girl, I might in time have forgiven. A man can swallow a great deal of pride for a steady wage and a warm house and a child he loves. But I saw the books. I am a man who takes things apart to understand them, and one day I took apart more than a watch. The finest pieces this house made were never only watches. They were sold to particular men, always the same kind of men, and inside the case of each one, beneath the movement, in a space I am ashamed to say my own hands learned to cut, there was a hollow. And into that hollow went the things that wicked and powerful men need to move across borders where no honest eye can follow. Stones with no papers. The keys to fortunes that must never be found. The quiet means by which the worst men in the world carry their wealth past every guard, because a beautiful watch on a gentleman's wrist is admired and insured and waved through, and no customs officer who ever lived will take a hammer to a masterpiece on a hunch. The watch was the perfect courier, and I had been building the courier, and I did not know. When I understood, I went to the man who runs the house. His name is Victor Reinhardt. He is the son of the name on the wall, and he built the hidden trade himself, and he is the man I called Only R in my little books, because for a long time I was afraid to write the whole of it down. He did not deny a word of it. He smiled the entire time, which is how I knew he meant to keep doing it until the day he died, and how I knew what he would do to anyone who tried to stop him. He offered me money. When I would not take it, he reminded me, without ever once saying the words, that I had a wife, and then, when your mother was gone, that I still had you. He stood at the back of the church the day we buried your mother, Nora. He watched me instead of the coffin. He came to remind me that he knew the road to my door and the face of my little girl. And I understood, holding your hand at the graveside, that as long as you were within his reach, he would always have his hand around my throat, and that I had only one way left to take it off. So I sent you away, and I made myself small and beaten and not worth the trouble, and I let you believe the cruelest thing a child can believe, that her father did not want her, because a girl who believed that would build her life far away from me and far away from them, and she would be safe, and she would live. There is no day of the last 25 years that I have not asked your forgiveness for it, and no day I would not do it again, because it worked, because you are alive to read this, and that is the only bargain I ever made that I do not regret. Everything in this room is yours. Sell it or keep it as you see fit. The men who study such things will tell you it is worth somewhere near $475 million, which is a number I set down only so that you will never let anyone tell you it is worth less. It will give you back the life I took from you with my own 2 hands, and your daughter the one I was never allowed to give you. But understand me, the watches were never the point. I built this room so that one day you would walk down that passage and read these words and finally know the truth, and the treasure was only ever the thing I left, so that you would never have to be afraid the way I was afraid. Now I must ask one last thing of you, and it is the hardest, and I am sorry. The proof is in the cabinet beside you. The books, the names, the watch with its hollow opened. It must reach people who cannot be bought, and Victor Reinhardt has bought a great many people, in a great many places, over a great many years, so you must be careful, and you must make many copies, and you must trust very few. Take it to the federal authorities, not to any small office a rich man can reach into. The calendar with my name on it will tell them I am not a liar. The watch cannot lie. I made it that way on purpose, in the year before you were born, Perhaps because some part of me already knew that one day it would have to speak for me after I could no longer speak for myself. Be brave, my girl. You come from brave people. Your mother was the bravest soul I ever knew, and you have more of her in you than you have ever been allowed to find out. Do not trust the smooth ones who come with offers. Do not believe them when they tell you the easy road is the kind one. Trust the few who knew me and wanted nothing from me. Trust your own eyes. And know, whatever they tell you about me when this is finished, whatever the papers say, that you were never the thing I gave away. You were the only thing I was ever trying to save. Your father. Nora set the pages down on the green blotter and sat in her father's chair in the buried room, full of his life's work, and did not move for a long time. Edith had come to stand beside her at some point, reading over her shoulder, and the old woman's hand was on Nora's back, warm and steady, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing in the language that would have fit. All her life, she had carried one simple story, polished smooth by 30 years of handling. The story of the girl her father had not wanted. She had built everything on top of it. The way she had loved Daniel, fast and total and terrified, because some part of her had never quite believed a person could choose to stay. The way she held Sadie one beat too long every single night. The careful armor she wore into every room before she even knew she was wearing it. And the story was a lie, had always been a lie, and the man who made her believe it had done so on purpose, deliberately, choosing 30 years of being hated alive over one quiet moment of being mourned dead, so that the daughter who thought he had thrown her away would build a life far enough from these men to outlast them. She did not yet know what a person was supposed to do with that. She thought she might be unlearning the lie for the rest of her life, and learning the truth underneath it, which was the harder of the two, because the truth was that she had been loved the entire time, fiercely, from a distance, in silence, and no one had ever once let her know. At last Edith spoke, and her voice had gone quiet and certain, the voice of a sheriff's wife of 31 years who has decided what needs doing. All right, she said. Here is what we do, and we do it tonight. We take that letter, and we take those books, and we take your mama's ring, and that little watch he made you, and we get out of this building and over to my place, where the doors lock and the dog barks. And first thing in the morning, we call a man named Dale Okafor at the state police that my Hal trusted with his life. And we do not call one single soul in this county before we call him, because I do not yet know who in this county that man in the suit has already bought. She squeezed Nora's shoulder. Your daddy was right about one thing for certain. You make copies, and you trust nobody you do not have to. Now use that phone of yours and take a picture of every last one of these watches, fast, in case we do not get back in here, and let us move. It steadied Nora to be told what to do. She stood, and she did it, moving along the cases with her phone, the small false click of the camera absurd in that holy room, capturing what she could of the moon and the turning cage and the chiming hammers and the 100-year calendar with her father's name cut deep into its back. She slid the ledgers into her bag until it would not close and carried the rest against her chest. She took up her mother's thin gold ring and put it on her own finger above her wedding band, where it fit as if it had been sized for her, and she closed her hand around the tiny rose gold watch he had wound every week for 24 years, and she put her mother's unread letter and her father's read one together into the inside pocket of her coat, over her heart, because there was nowhere safer she could think to put them. Then she climbed the 4 shallow steps and went back up the passage of small lights, which dimmed behind her one by one as she passed, the photographs and the drawing and the wedding day going dark in their niches, as if her father were quietly closing his hands over them again now that she had finally seen, and she pushed through the steel door into the cold back room, and through the canvas curtain, and out into the long front room full of stopped clocks where she had stood a lifetime ago at the beginning of the night. She stopped there a moment despite Edith's hand on her arm. She looked at the bench and the worn brass tweezers and the stool pushed back at its angle, at the place where he had sat. She wanted, absurdly, to say something to the empty room. She did not have it yet. She thought she might spend the rest of her life looking for it. And then headlights swept across the dusty front windows and laid the long shadows of 100 frozen clocks across the floor. A car had pulled to the curb outside. Not the pale one from before. A different car, older and longer and very quiet, the kind of car that is washed by someone else, and it stopped directly in front of the shop, and its engine went still. Beside Nora, at the glass, Edith had gone rigid, and the warmth had drained entirely out of her, and the flashlight hung forgotten at her side. A rear door of the car opened. A man got out, slowly, with effort, and another pair of hands reached to help him, Keen's hands. And Nora saw that the old man who rose up out of the back of that car had been tall once and was stooped now, and that his hair was white and very fine, and that his coat was beautiful, and that he leaned on a cane with a silver head, and that he straightened on the sidewalk and looked up at the faded gold letters above the door of Brandt Clock and Watch Repair with the perfect, unhurried calm of a man who has never in his life been told no by anyone and meant it. "That is him," Edith whispered, and her voice had lost everything that had been kind in it. "That is the old one. The one who used to come, years back, before he sent the young ones in his place. I have not laid eyes on him and I do not know how long." She took a small step back from the glass. "Nora, what does he want? Coming himself, this hour of the night?" But Nora already knew, the way she had known the watch would fit the door, the way you know a thing in the body before the mind will say it. She knew the stoop of those shoulders from a photograph with a single line of black ink drawn through the face. She knew the patience in that white head from the back pew of a church she had stood in at 7 years old, too small to understand why her father's hand had tightened so hard around hers. The man on the sidewalk lifted his pale eyes from the sign and found her through the dusty glass. One stopped clock among 100, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the small private satisfaction of a patient man at the end of a very long wait. Behind her the shop stood full of her father's stopped clocks, 100 frozen faces that had given up at the hour he last put down his tools, and in her bag were the books that could end this man, and in her coat, over her heart, were 2 letters from the 2 people who had loved her most and been taken from her, and on the sidewalk on the other side of a pane of dusty glass stood the reason she had grown up without either of them. Some cold and steady thing settled into place in Nora's chest then, something she had never felt before and would never afterward be entirely without. It was not courage, exactly. It was closer to arithmetic. She had spent her whole life paying for what this man had done, without even knowing his name, and she had only just been handed the size of the bill, and she was finished paying it quietly. Victor Reinhardt had come, himself, at last, to collect what he had spent 25 years believing would one day be his. The bell above the door sounded again, that small bright music made for announcing customers, and through the dusty glass Nora watched Victor Reinhardt come up out of the car and onto the sidewalk, slow and stooped over the silver head of his cane, Keen's hand hovering at his elbow, without quite touching it. It would take him a moment to cross to the door. An old man moved like an old man, even an old man like this one. She used the moment. Her phone was already in her hand, low against her hip, angled away from the window, and her thumb was moving before she had finished deciding to move it. The photograph she had taken in the vault, the moon riding its little sky of blue stone, the small cage built to turn forever, the silent hammers, and the 100-year calendar with her father's name cut deep into its back, and the half-dozen hurried, blurred shots of the open ledgers. She gathered all of them and sent them, twice. Once to her own email, where they would sit untouchable on a machine in some city she had never seen. And once to Carol, with a message she typed without looking down, her hands steadier than she had any right to expect. "Keep these. Do not delete them, no matter what anyone tells you. If you have not heard from me by morning, call the police, not the local ones. Call the FBI, and tell them everything and give them these." The little arrow spun, and then it was gone. Whatever happened in the shop in the next few minutes, the truth had already left the building, and there was no calling it back. She put the phone in her coat pocket and lifted her head, because the door was opening, because the man who had unmade her family before she was old enough to spell her own name was finally close enough to see her face. He was older up close than in the photograph. The photograph her father had drawn a single line of black ink across 30 years ago, but it was the same man under the years, the long jaw and the high pale brow and the eyes the cold near white of skim milk. His coat had been made for him by someone's careful hands a long way from Hartsboro. He came through the door and stopped just inside it, and let his gaze travel slowly around the room, over the stopped clocks and the worn bench and the locked glass case. And he breathed the place in, the oil and the old wood, and something moved across his face that in another man might have been sorrow. I have not stood in a room with his work in a very long time, Victor Reinhardt said. His voice was light and dry and entirely unhurried. The voice of a man who has spent his life being waited for. You will forgive an old man a moment of feeling. There was no hand in the world like his. I should know. I looked for one for 40 years and never found its equal. I know who you are, Nora said. Yes. He turned the pale eyes on her, and they were not unkind, which was somehow worse than if they had been. I rather thought you might by now. You have been a busy woman tonight. He glanced at the heavy canvas curtain at the back, behind which the steel door still stood open on its cold, dark passage, and a small hunger crossed his face and was smoothed away. You opened it. 25 years we could not so much as find the seam of it, and you walked in with a key in your pocket and opened it in an evening. He would have enjoyed that enormously. He had a cruel sense of humor, your father, for such a sentimental man. Do not talk about him like you knew him, Nora said. But I did know him. Reinhardt lowered himself, with Keen's help and without asking anyone's leave, onto the stool by the bench, the stool her father had sat on, and Nora felt that like a hand laid flat on a bruise. I knew him better than you ever did, child, if you will allow me to be unkind for the sake of being honest. I knew the size of his gift and the size of his pride, which were the two largest things about him, and I knew that the second would one day ruin the first, and I was right. He set both hands on the silver head of the cane and regarded her almost gently. He could have had everything. I offered him the world. Do you understand what your father was? Once or twice in a century the trade produces a hand like his. I would have made him the most celebrated name in the history of the craft. All I asked in return was his silence about a thing that has been done quietly by every great house since the first king wanted his gold moved where his rivals could not see it. The watches travel. Beautiful things travel, child. They always have. Admired and insured and waved through every border in the world, and inside them travels whatever a careful man wishes to send. It is the oldest arrangement there is. Your father pretended to be shocked by it, as though he had not spent 10 years cutting the very compartments with his own brilliant hands. He didn't know what they were for, Nora said. No, Reinhardt agreed. And when he learned, he might simply have looked away, as wiser men have always looked away, and kept his gift and his good name and his wife and his daughter and his warm house, and died famous and old. Instead he chose this. He lifted one thin hand off the cane and gestured at the dim and crowded shop, the faded sign, the dust. He chose to bury himself alive in a town no one has heard of, to throw his own child away into the dark, to make himself into a beaten old repairman. Also that he could keep a secret that changed nothing, that stopped nothing, that saved no one. The trade went on perfectly well without him. It is going on perfectly well tonight. The only thing his great sacrifice accomplished was 30 years of his own misery and yours. And you call him the one who was trying to save somebody. The pale eyes did not blink. He was a man so in love with his own pride that he set fire to his entire life to keep it warm, and he called. The smoke nobility, and you have driven 3 hours to a cold shop to weep over the ashes. It was very well done. Nora would understand that later, lying awake. He had taken every soft and grieving place in her and pressed on all of them at once. And for a moment, one ugly cracked moment, some small exhausted part of her almost believed him, because it would have been so much easier to believe that her father had been a fool than to carry what he had actually been. And then she thought of the tiny rose-gold watch in her pocket, wound by hand every week for 24 years so that it would be running to meet her, and she thought of the photograph dusted clean above the register for 34 years, and she thought of a man choosing the cold and the dark and his daughter's hatred over her safety every single day for the whole of her life, and the crack closed, and what filled it was not grief. You're afraid of it, Nora said. Reinhardt's hands went still on the cane. That's why you came yourself, she said. The words were coming now from the steady cold place that had opened in her chest at the window, and she did not have to reach for them. An old man, 2 in the morning, 3 hours from wherever you live, with a cane and a coat and a driver. You didn't send Keen. You came. Because there's one thing in that vault you cannot let exist, and it isn't the money. You have all the money there is. It's the calendar. The 100-year movement, the real one, the first one, with his name on the back where you put another man's. She watched it land, watched the thinnest thread of something tighten at the corner of his jaw, and she knew she had found it. Your whole house was built on that watch. The finest watch of the age, everyone says so, and it has the wrong name on it, and you have known that every day for 25 years. You're not here to buy a collection. You're here because somewhere in that room is the one object on earth that proves you were never the genius. You were only ever the man who robbed him. The silence in the shop was enormous. 100 stop clocks held their 100 different hours. You read his little notebooks, Reinhardt said at last, very softly, and the lightness had gone out of his voice. How tiresome. He always did write too much down. He looked at her with something new, a flat attention, the way a man looks at a lock he had assumed was simple and has just discovered is not. Let us be plain, then, since you prefer it. Name your number. You are a widow with debts and a child, I am told. There is a sum that ends every difficulty you will ever have, that buys your daughter a life you cannot imagine, and all it requires is that you walk out of here tonight and forget the address. The collection comes to me. The books come to me. The watch comes to me. And you and that woman beside you go home and live like queens and never speak of Hartsboro again. No, Nora said. Think carefully. I have thought, she said. And there's something I need you to understand before this is over, because you came all this way, so you should hear it. She took one step toward him, and Edith moved with her, half a pace behind, the heavy flashlight low in the old woman's hand. You lost. You lost a long time ago, and you have spent 25 years too proud to know it. You sat outside an empty shop and waited for an old man to die so you could finally get in, and he died in his own bed, in his own time, an honest man, having already beaten you. He built the vault. He gave me the key. He left the proof where you couldn't reach it. There was never one single thing you could do about any of it, and there still isn't. She let that sit. And those photographs you want so badly, the watch, the books, every page. They left this building before you ever walked through that door. They are on a machine in a city, and they are on my neighbor's telephone, and by tomorrow they will be in the hands of people your money has never once been able to buy. You can take the books out of my bag. You can take my phone and crush it under your shoe. It does not matter anymore. It is already gone. You came here to put out a fire that is already burning in 100 other places, and you are too old and too late, and you have already lost. For a long moment Victor Reinhardt simply looked at her, and the milk pail eyes were perfectly empty, and Nora understood that she was looking at the thing under all the cultured sorrow, the thing her father had seen across a desk, and at the back of a church, the patient nothing at the center of him. You are very like him, he said. It is not a compliment. He turned his head, slightly, toward Keen, and his voice when it came was light again, almost bored, the voice of a man ordering a meal. The calendar is behind the curtain, down the stair. Bring it up, and put them somewhere quiet while you do. What happened next happened fast. King did not move. That was the first thing, the thing Nora would remember, that the careful man in the charcoal coat stood exactly where he was and did not move, and a flicker of something crossed his face that she realized was calculation, because Keen was a man who had stayed alive and free a long time by never once doing the unforgivable thing in a place where it could be seen. But the other man moved, the younger one who had driven, broad through the shoulders, who had come in behind them and stood by the door, and he crossed the floor toward Nora and reached for the strap of the bag on her shoulder, the bag heavy with her father's ledgers. Edith hit him. She brought the long steel flashlight down across the man's forearm with the flat, unhesitating violence of a woman who had been a lawman's wife for 31 years and had decided, some minutes ago, exactly what she was prepared to do. And the man bellowed, and the bag dropped, and Edith put herself square between him and Nora with the flashlight up like a club, a gray-haired woman in a diner apron, and said, "You will not touch this girl." The younger man's hand went under his coat and came out with a gun. The shop went very still around the small black shape of it. Nora had never had a gun pointed near her in her life. It did not look the way it looked in the pictures. It looked small and stupid and absolutely final, and the man's hand was shaking with pain and fury, and Reinhardt was watching all of it from her father's stool with no more expression than a man watching rain, and Keen said, sharply, the first crack she had heard in his smoothness all night, "Put that away. Not here. It is finished. The evidence is gone. She is telling the truth, and you know she is. Put it away." "Bring me the watch," Victor Reinhardt said again, to no one, to the room, an old man who had waited his whole life and would not leave without the one thing, and the younger man's knuckle whitened on the trigger. And the windows turned white with light. Not one light. Many. Headlights, high and hard, swinging across the dusty glass from up and down Larch Street at once, and the sound of engines and doors slamming, one after another. And then a voice, a man's voice, raised and rough and close, calling not for the police and not for help, but a single word, calling, "Edith? Edith, you in there?" The younger man flinched toward the windows, and the gun went off. It was enormously loud in that small room, and the bullet went high and wide and struck the face of one of the tall case clocks against the wall, and the glass burst, and the brass works behind it sang a single broken note, and were still. A clock that had stopped years ago shot through the heart, and no one was hurt. And in the ringing silence after it, the shop filled with light and noise and people. The door banged open under a big man's hand, and the bell jangled wildly, and there were men in the doorway, 4 of them, 5. Men in canvas coats thrown over nightclothes, a heavy man with a shotgun broken open over his arm, and 2 younger ones behind him, and more coming across the street. The men of Hartsboro who had been asleep 10 minutes ago, and were not asleep now, drawn out of their beds into the cold by an old woman's standing instruction and the sound of a shot, and they came through. The door into the shop full of stopped clocks, and they saw the gun, and they did not stop. And behind them, hard on their heels, came the harder thing, the thing the gun and the men could not have been. The long shape of a state police cruiser pulling up onto the sidewalk with its lights turning the whole street red and blue, and a trooper out of it before it had fully stopped, and another, and a flat, amplified voice telling everyone in the building to put their hands where they could be seen. It was over in less than a minute. The younger man dropped the gun the instant the troopers came through the door, because a man with a gun and 3 other men in a room is one thing, and a man with a gun in a room flooding with armed police and half a furious town is another, and he put his hands on his head and went down to his knees onto the old wood floor. Keene, the careful man, had his hands raised and his face composed before the first trooper reached him. Already, Nora suspected, composing the version of the night he would tell, the lawyer he would call, the distance he would put between himself and the gun. He had not touched it. He would make a great deal of that in the months to come, and it would not save him, but he did not know that yet. And Victor Reinhardt sat on her father's stool in the middle of it all, in his beautiful coat, both hands resting on the silver head of his cane, and did not raise them, and did not move, and watched the room fill with the wreckage of his patient quarter of a century with an expression of mild, remote distaste, as though someone had served him a wine that had turned. A trooper came toward him, the older of the 2, a broad, calm black man with gray at his temples and a quiet way of moving, and he did not shout at the old man the way he had shouted at the others. He stopped in front of the stool and looked down at Reinhardt for a moment, and then he looked across the room at the gray-haired woman in the apron who was holding the dead man's daughter by both shoulders, and his careful face moved. "Edith," he said. "How's Edith? I came soon as Roy got me. I was closer than I had any right to be." His voice roughened. "I am sorry it took me this long to come back to this town." "Dale Okafor," Edith said, and her own voice broke on it. And Nora understood that this was the man, the one Hal had trusted, the one they were to call, and no one else. Arrived not in the careful morning they had planned, but in the middle of the worst night. 3 hours early, because an old woman had left word with her night cook before she ever crossed the street, the way the wife of a sheriff of 31 years leaves word, because she does not walk into the dark stupid. "You knew," Nora said to her, half laughing, half not, the shock breaking over her now in waves. "When you crossed the street, you already knew. I told Roy if I wasn't back at my own counter in 20 minutes to call Dale's cell and wake the Henning boys and anybody else with a truck," Edith said, and wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, fierce and embarrassed. "Then I went and got my flashlight. A person doesn't get to be my age in this business by trusting a man in a good suit, honey. Your daddy taught me that, near as anybody." Officer Okafor turned back to the old man on the stool. "Sir," he said, "on your feet, if you can manage it. You are under arrest." Victor Reinhardt looked up at him, and then past him, across the crowded ruined shop, to Nora, and for the first and only time that night the milk pail eyes settled on her with their full and undivided weight, and his thin mouth moved. "The watch," he said. "Where is the watch?" And Nora, standing in her father's shop with her father's ledgers. at her feet and her father's town at her back and her mother's ring on her hand, looked at the man who had wanted that one thing so badly that he had thrown away his own freedom in the small hours of a cold morning to reach for it. And she felt no triumph, which surprised her. She felt something quieter and older and much more like her father. "It's downstairs," she said. "Behind the door he built that you could never open. It has his name on it. And tomorrow it's going to a museum with his name on it, where everyone in the world can come and read it for as long as the world lasts. And there is nothing you can do about that. Not with all the money there is, not ever again." She held the empty pail, eyes a moment longer. "You came all this way to take his name off it. You're going to spend whatever you have left watching the whole world learn it instead." For just an instant, something flickered in Victor Reinhardt's face, something that was not calm. Then it was gone, smoothed away under the long discipline of a life, and he rose from the stool with the help of his cane, slowly, an old man getting to his feet, and he let the trooper take his arm, and he did not look at the curtain or the vault or the watch again. He was led out through the shop and the jangling bell and the crowd of men in night clothes who parted to let him pass and stared at him. This stooped, courteous monster who had haunted their town for a generation, and out into the turning red and blue light, and into the back of the cruiser, and that was the last time Nora Vance ever saw him in person, though it was very far from the last she heard of him. She stood at the dusty front window and watched the cruiser's lights pull away down Larch Street and turn at the corner by the church with its stopped clock, and she did not feel the thing she had expected to feel. She had imagined, in the few minutes she had been able to imagine anything at all, that there would be some rush of triumph, some hot, clean satisfaction in watching the man taken away in the back of a car. There was none. What she felt instead, standing among her father's stopped clocks with her father's town crowding the cold doorway behind her, was something low and steady and almost unbearably tender. The feeling of a weight she had been born under being set down at last by hands other than her own. She had not won anything tonight. Her father had won it, years ago, alone, in the dark, and she had only lived long enough to stand here and hear the verdict read. The rest of that night was a long blur of lights and questions and kindness. Officer Okafor would not let her say more than a few words until the federal people could be there to hear them. And he was already on his radio about that before the old man's car had pulled away, careful, methodical, a man building something that could not be knocked down, and Nora understood that he too knew exactly what it meant to do this right. Edith made coffee on the diner's big urn across the street, and the whole strange company of them ended up there as the sky went gray. The troopers, and the Henning brothers, and the heavy man whose shotgun had never been needed. All of them around the counter where Tomas Brandt had eaten dry toast in silence for years, and Nora sat on his stool, the end one, back to the wall, where he had always sat, and let an old woman put a warm cup in her hands. She drank the coffee. Her hands had finally started to shake, now that it was safe to shake, and the warm cup helped. Around her the men of Hartsboro talked low and looked at her sideways with a careful country kindness, not asking anything. Just there, the way people stand near a fire, and one of the Henning brothers fixed the lock on the diner door that had never quite sat right and would not take $1 for it, and somebody put more bread on. Nora sat on her father's stool with her back to the wall and watched the gray light come up over the main street he had looked at every morning for 25 years, and she understood that she had driven into this town a stranger 2 days before and was somehow leaving it as one of its own, claimed, the daughter of a man it turned out the whole town had quietly loved a great deal more than they had ever found a way to tell him. What waited beyond that night was not over quickly. The truth, once it is finally out of the dark, still has to be carried, and the carrying took more than a year. The federal agents came the next morning, 2 of them, and then more, and the ledgers her father had kept for 25 years turned out to be the most patient and complete record anyone had ever laid eyes on of a thing that the most respected name in the trade had been doing very quietly for the better part of a century. He had written down everything. The buyers and the dates and the routes and the contents, the hollow cut beneath each movement, and what had written inside it across which border in which year, a name and a number for every beautiful watch that had carried the wealth of terrible men past every honest eye in the world, because no one breaks open a masterpiece. It was, one of the agents told Nora much later, the single best piece of evidence he had handled in a 30-year career, and it had been assembled in secret by a small-town watch repairman the world believed had given up, working alone, under a lamp, at night, for the daughter he was never going to see. Walter Pohl handled the estate to the last, as her father had appointed him to, his trembling hands moving slowly through the great stack of papers that the fortune had become, and he lived just long enough to see it all done right, which Nora was glad of. He came to the museum on the day the calendar was unveiled, very old by then, leaning on a young clerk's arm, and he stood a long while in front of the glass reading the card, and when he turned to Nora his eyes were wet behind his glasses. "I told you once," he said, "that I was not certain I had ever sent anything sadder across my desk than that man's whole heart, folded up small inside a money order every Christmas." He looked back at the watch with her father's name shining behind the glass. "I believe," he said, "that I have now seen the other half of that sentence." And he pressed her hand the way he had pressed the keys into it on the first morning, and he did not say anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying. Reinhardt and Sohn, the oldest name in the craft, did not survive it. The house was finished within the year, its doors shut, its archives seized, its name turned overnight from the most admired in the trade to the most notorious. Keene, the careful man who had never touched the gun, was charged with a long list of things and convicted of most of them, and the great distance he had spent his life keeping between himself and the unforgivable act turned out, in the end, to be no distance at all. The younger man went away for longer, and Victor Reinhardt, who had built the hidden trade with his own hands and run it for 50 years and stood at the back of a church to threaten a grieving man, was charged with the whole towering weight of it, and he was very old, and his lawyers were very good, and the case ground on through motion after motion, but he never spent another comfortable night a free man, and he never got within 100 miles of the one thing he had come for. He died, Nora learned, in a hospital bed under guard, before the last of the appeals had even been heard, an old man at the end of a long life that had been emptied out and held up to the light at the very last, and the obituaries, when they ran, did not call him a great man of the trade. They called him a thief and a smuggler whose house had been brought down by the evidence of the very genius he had robbed, and they printed, all of them, the name of the watch repairman from Hartsboro and a photograph of a watch. Because that was the other thing, the thing that mattered more to Nora than any verdict. The world learned her father's name. The 100-year calendar, the real one, the first one, was authenticated by every expert who was brought to look at it, and the story of it ran everywhere. The masterwork of the age that had been sold under another man's name for 30 years, recovered at last from a sealed vault beneath a small-town repair shop, signed on the back, where it had always been signed, T. Brandt. Horologists who had spent their careers admiring the famous watch and crediting the famous house had to learn a new name, and they learned it, and they spoke it with a kind of awe that grew the more they understood what he had done and how. And the watch that Victor Reinhardt had crossed an ocean of years to erase became, under its true maker's name, one of the most celebrated objects in the history of the craft. It was placed, as Nora had promised the old man it would be, in a museum, behind glass, with a long card beside it that told the whole story, the theft and the silence and the sacrifice and the daughter and the key, so that no one who stood before it would ever again be able to pretend they did not know whose hands had made it. People came from everywhere to read that card. Some of them wept in front of it. Nora knew, because she stood near it once, on the day it was unveiled, and watched a stranger she would never meet read her father's life off a small printed card and put a hand to her mouth, and Nora had to go and stand outside for a while. There was, at the end of all of it, a very great deal of money. The collection was worth, when the experts had finished their careful counting, close to the figure her father had set down in his letter so that no one could tell her it was less. Somewhere near $475 million, the labor of 10,000 nights turned at last into a number. It cleared, in an afternoon, the $40,000 in red that had been crushing her, a thing so small against the whole that the lawyers nearly laughed, and it kept the house she and Daniel had loved, and it bought Sadie a life that the woman in the pawn shop parking lot 14 months before could not have let herself dream of. But the watches had never been the point. Her father had written, and Nora had read that letter enough times by then to have it by heart, and she did not intend to let them become the point now. So she kept some of it, enough, more than enough, and the rest she turned into the thing she thought he would have wanted, though he had been too proud and too private a man to ever say so. She started a foundation, and she put both their names on it, her mother's and her father's, the Lena and Tomas Brandt Foundation, and she gave it 2 pieces of work, because those were the 2 ruins she knew. It went after the kind of debt that had nearly buried her, the medical debt that falls on ordinary families like a roof caving in, and it lifted that weight off of people who would never know the name of the stranger who had done it, the way her father had lifted a weight off of her every Christmas for 25 years and never signed his name to it either. And it taught the craft. It found young people who had no one, the way her father had once had no one, and the way she had grown up believing she had no one. And it taught them the thing the house had tried to bury under another man's name, the patient, impossible art of building time with your own 2 hands, so that the knowledge Victor Reinhardt had tried to own in a race would instead belong to anyone in the world willing to sit down at a bench and learn it. The first classes were held in the front room of the shop on Larch Street, among the clocks, at her father's own bench, and Nora thought that of everything she did with the money, that was the part that would have made the hard old man on the stool come closest to smiling. It was a long time before she read her mother's letter. She had carried it the whole while, the single folded sheet, from the last niche, soft with her father's handling, over her heart through the worst of that night and home again, and through all the months of agents and lawyers and reporters, and she had not been able to open it, because she had understood, holding it, that there was only so much a person could survive in a season, and that her mother's voice was a thing she had to be strong enough to hear. She waited until the noise was over. She waited until a quiet evening more than a year later, in the apartment above the shop, which she had not been able to bring herself to sell, with the lamp on and the clocks she had finally let a young apprentice begin to repair, ticking softly through the walls for the first time in years, and she sat in her father's chair, and she opened her mother's letter, and she read it. "My darling girl," it said, in a hand Nora had never seen and knew at once, the way you know a voice. "If you are reading this, you are grown, and I am not there, and I am so sorry for that, sorrier than these few lines can carry, because there is nothing in this world I wanted more than to watch you become whoever you are now, reading this. I have to be quick. I do not have the time I thought I had, and there are things I need you to know more than I need to be brave about saying them. You were wanted. From the very first moment, before you were anything more than a hope, you were wanted, by me and by your father, more than you will ever be able to measure until you have a child of your own and feel it yourself. Do not ever let anyone, do not ever let your own sad heart on a bad night tell you otherwise. And your father, listen to me about your father, because I know him better than anyone living, and I will not be there to remind you. He is a hard man to read. He keeps everything inside where it is safe, the way he keeps the works inside a watch, and one day, my love, it may be that he does something that looks to you like coldness, or even like he is turning away from you. And I need you to know, now, in case I cannot tell you then, that whatever it looks like, it is not what it is. Your father loves you more than his own life. He would give up anything, everything, himself, before he would give up you. If a day ever comes when you doubt that, when he seems lost to you, I want you to remember that I told you, with whatever time I had left, that the man is made of love all the way down, and he only ever hid it because he was so afraid of losing the people he loved that he could not bear to hold them where the world could see. Be happy, my Nora. That is the whole of what I want. Be happy, and be brave, and know that you were loved by 2 people completely, even the one of us who could not stay, even the one of us who, I am afraid, may not always know how to show it. I have to go now. I love you. I love you. I love you. Your mother, Lena. Nora sat with the letter for a long time in the ticking dark. Her mother had written it not knowing any of it, not the house, not the threat, not the 30 years of silence and the railway platform and the lie her father would tell to keep her alive. She had written it from a hospital bed with the last of her strength, a young woman who simply knew her husband, who knew the one true thing about him all the way down, and who had reached forward across 30 years and a death she could see coming to put her hand over the exact wound her daughter was going to carry, and to tell her, before it was even made, that it was not what it would look like. Whatever it looks like, it is not what it is. She had been right. She had been right about all of it, and she had not lived to know how right. And Nora put her face in her hands in her father's chair and let her mother and her father both, at last, all the way in. She went to him, after that. She had not been able to before, in all the long months of noise, But a few days after she read her mother's letter, she drove the 3 hours north again, alone, and she found the small cemetery on the hill above Hartsboro where her father lay, and her mother beside him, the two of them together again at last under the same patient sky, and she stood at the foot of the plain stone that carried only his name, Tomas Brandt, and the 2 dates, and nothing else, because he had been a man who signed his name to nothing. For a long time she could not speak. The wind moved in the long grass. Somewhere down in the town a single clock she had not yet had mended was striking the wrong hour, and she could hear it being wrong, and she thought that he would have hated that, and the thought made her almost smile. And then she said the thing she had wanted to say in the empty shop on the first night and had not had the words for, the thing it had taken her a whole year and 2 letters and a vault full of his silence to finally find. "I know now," she said, out loud, to the stone and the grass and the wind. "I know what you did. I know what it cost you. I spent my whole life believing you threw me away, and you were holding on to me the entire time, every single day, and I never knew it. And I am sorry that I never knew it, and I forgive you. And the truth is there was never one thing to forgive." She stayed there until the light began to go. She left her mother's flowers on her mother's side of the stone, and she laid her own hand flat against her father's name for a moment, the small rose-gold watch ticking quietly on her wrist, his last gift given and received at the very end. And then she got back in the car and drove down the hill into the town that was slowly learning to keep time again. The years after that were good ones, and there were many of them, and they were quiet in the way that good years mostly are, which is to say there is not much of a story in them, only a life. Nora kept the shop. She could not have said exactly why, except that it was the one place on earth where her father was still entirely himself, and she found she did not want a world without a room like that in it. She lived part of the year in the house she and Daniel had, loved, and part of it above the shop in Hartsboro, and the diner across the street stayed open, and Edith got older and slower and never once let Nora pay for her own coffee. And the two of them sat at the counter on Tomas's stool by turns and talked about everything and nothing until the morning Edith did not come down, peacefully, in her sleep. An old woman who had saved a stranger's life with a flashlight and a phone call and never thought it was anything worth mentioning. Nora buried her near Hal, and she put up the stone herself, and she never afterward walked past that empty diner without saying good morning to it under her breath. Sadie grew up. She grew up dark-eyed and quiet and watchful, with her father's eyes and, everyone said, something of her grandfather's hands, and she grew up in a world with no roof caving in, no pawn shops, no bed too big and too empty. The childhood her grandfather had set fire to his whole life to make possible for a daughter he never met. When she was old enough, Nora took her down to the shop and gave her the small things from the niches, the wedding photograph and the crayon drawing and the laughing woman in the butter-colored dress, and told her all of it, the whole long story, the genius and the thief and the vault and the key and the love kept in the dark. And Sadie listened the way she listened to everything, completely, and at the end of it she was quiet for a while. And then she asked if she could learn to fix the clocks. So she did. She sat at her grandfather's bench in the front room with one of the Foundation's old teachers, and she learned the patient, impossible art. And she turned out to have the hands for it. And Nora would stand in the doorway sometimes and watch her own daughter bent over the works of a watch under the lamp, the dark head and the still concentration, and have to grip the frame of the door, because for one cracked and beautiful second she could see him there. And the little watch ran again. Nora had wound it that first terrible night, before any of the rest of it, sitting in Edith's diner as the sky went gray, the tiny rose-gold watch he had made for a girl's 10th birthday, and wound by hand every week for 24 years and never been able to give her. She had turned the small crown the way she had turned the second crown in the vault door, and the hands had begun to move. The time he had tried to give her starting up again at last under her own fingers, only 25 years late, and she had worn it from that day on. It was sized for a child's wrist, and it fit her own slender one closely, and it kept perfect time, because he had built it to. And when Sadie was grown, Nora took it off and fastened it onto her daughter's wrist, and told her it had been wound and kept running by hand for longer than either of them had been alive, by a man who refused to let it stop, and that now it was hers. And that her great gift was that she had never had to learn what it cost. Sadie wore it every day for the rest of her life. Nora took her to the museum once, when the girl was old enough to understand what she was seeing. They stood together in front of the glass, the dark-eyed daughter and her mother, and read the long card that told the whole of it. The theft and the silence and the sacrifice and the sealed vault and the key. And at the bottom of the card the name, T. Brandt, the name the world had at last been made to learn. Sadie was quiet for a long time, the way she went quiet about everything that truly reached her. Then she looked up at the great watch behind the glass, the 100-year calendar keeping its faithful and unbroken count of days. It would go on counting long after every person now alive was gone. And she looked down at the small rose-gold watch on her own wrist, built by the same two hands, and she said, very softly, that she thought she finally understood why her mother had always told her that being given something easily was its own kind of inheritance, and a rare one. Nora put an arm around her daughter in front of the glass and did not quite trust her voice to answer, and the two of them stood there a while longer in the quiet, in front of the life's work of a man that neither of them had been permitted to know while he lived, and that both of them had come, in the fullness of time, to know completely. There was one more thing Nora did, near the end, that she told almost no one about. The clocks of Hartsboro had all been stopping for years, the way clocks do in a town that is forgetting itself, the old ones with no one left who knew how to mend them, and the worst and most visible of them was the clock in the white steeple of the church on the main street, which had stood frozen at 4:10 for as long as anyone could remember, a stopped face over a fading town. Through the foundation, quietly, Nora had it repaired. It took two of the apprentices the better part of a winter, up in the cold of the steeple with the works of the old tower clock spread around them. But in the spring they finished, and on a clear morning the hands of the church clock moved for the first time in decades, and somewhere below it a bell that had been silent for a generation rang the hour over the rooftops of Hartsboro. And people came out of the diner and the hardware store and stood in the street and looked up. Nora stood among them and looked up too, at her father's town keeping time again. And she thought of a long room full of 100 stop clocks that had all quit at the moment their keeper put down his tools. And she thought that this, finally, was the answer she had stood in that room looking for and not been able to give, on the first night. The thing she had wanted to say to the empty shop and had not had the words for. The man who had spent his whole life keeping time for other people, in silence, asking for nothing, signing his name to nothing, had a daughter now who had started the time running again, in his town, and in his shop, and on her own wrist, and in his name, where everyone could see it, for as long as the world lasted. He had built her a road back home through 30 years of dark, and she had walked it, and at the end of it she had found out the one thing he had ever truly needed her to know. And then she had spent the rest of her life making sure that no one would ever again be able to forget him. The silence was over. The clocks were running. And somewhere, she had to believe, the hard old man on the stool had finally, after everything, allowed himself to smile. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.